In my more than 3 decades, I've been to so many nice events in this room, and it's really so good to see you all coming out. My name is Dale Graydon, Department of History. I get to introduce the introducer and the speaker. I simply want to make a couple of comments. This fall semester, Professor Kenton Bird is away on sabbatical leave in rainy New Zealand. And my colleague in modern language and culture, Sarah Nelson, and myself are trying to do everything that Kenton does alone. Dr. Daniel Buckfitch is also, I'm sure he'll be here. He is one of the original founders of the Renfrew Colloquium. I encourage you to come on out. I just put a plug for the Renfrew Colloquium, given that I like to attend it and have learned an immense amount. He was a professor here, I think in chemistry, world-renowned professor. At his late in his career, he gave a pot of money to the University of Idaho because he wanted interdisciplinary, some sort of an interdisciplinary program. And on 9/11/2001, since we're talking about anniversaries, was the first Renfrew. So we're at, I think, year 22. And it meets weekly. Come on out, 12:30 to 1:20. And you can see on the web the schedule of the speakers who are coming. This is the 75th year of the Borah. And in this 22nd year of the Renfrew, every year you can see the quality, just by the brochure, the quality of the Borah speakers. And the Borah and Professor Smith through the Martin Institute have graciously, every single year of the Borah Symposium, combined with the Renfrew so that we could have some of these outstanding intellectuals, speakers, leaders, etc., give presentations. So we're particularly appreciative that this year that this tradition can continue. So without further ado, Shaylin Mills is a undergraduate, stellar undergraduate. I've heard from her professor in modern languages and cultures and international studies, combined degree, and she is going to introduce Bill. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Professor Smith. He is one of my favorite professors. I'll just throw that in there really quick. Professor Smith has worked for the Martin Institute, the Borah Foundation, and the Program in International Studies since being hired at the University of Idaho in 2000. All three of these entities focus on peace and the causes of war and the conditions necessary for peace in the international system, which is one of the themes of this year's Borah Symposium. This is all done via a mix of reaching, research, and outreach. What's interesting about Bill's profession, unlike many other academic jobs, is that he has to focus on a little bit of everything. His knowledge is very extensive instead of focusing on just a specific specialization. This makes him something of an expert generalist regarding topics and the myriad of things that fit together in the world. Professor Smith has been with the Borah Foundation for more than 20 years. First as the program coordinator for the annual symposium and later as the director of the foundation. He counts working with the interdisciplinary Borah committee as one of the great joys of his job and points to the 23 symposia they've planned together as evidence of what is possible when groups of faculty, students, and staff receive a charge and set out to fulfill it. He says representing an honorific entity, such as the Borah Foundation, is a welcome way to guide one's work and to provide a framework for programming and implementing outreach at U of I. Without further ado, I would love to introduce Professor Smith to the floor.
Thank you both to Shay and to Professor Graydon. The very first event I programmed as part of the Borah Symposium featured Professor Graydon on a panel discussion in 2001 about economic globalization. So it's not a circle because I think we're going to be getting up there in age, but we're still on an arc, not completing a circle yet. We've got a ways to go on the voyage. I'd like to build on this idea of interdisciplinarity that's part of the Renfrew, because one of the very unique things about the Borah is, as Shay mentioned, the interdisciplinary nature of the planning and implementation of it. These kinds of programs happen at universities around the country, indeed around the world, but they're typically planned by specialists in a specific discipline, generally speaking, in international relations, or in a peace studies program. And whereas we draw students, faculty, and staff from across campus to contribute their expertise, which results in different and I think better and more accessible programming. It certainly would be something that would appeal to Senator Borah, who, when he was working on the Outlawry of War movement, was very keenly interested in the way it applied to local communities and Idahoans. In fact, one of the early groups that adopted his I wouldn't say adopted because they didn't have to be convinced particularly of it, but who went along with his promotion of the Outlawry of War movement was the Grange community of Idaho. All across Idaho and all the small hamlets and towns where there were Grange halls, they passed resolutions supporting the Outlawry of War movement because they saw that these grand global ideas had application locally in Idaho. And so we'll connect these ideas back, and that's something I appreciate about the Borah planning process and our partnership with the Renfrew colloquium. So as mentioned, I do represent these two honorific entities, the Martin Institute and the Borah Foundation. So they represent two sons of Idaho. Borah himself was a native of Illinois, was trained as a lawyer in Kansas, and then came to Idaho afterwards. Boyd Martin was born in Idaho, moved to California for his PhD at Stanford University, and then returned. One of the things that's interesting about representing these two things is while the divisions are pretty well connected, the approaches of the two men to the way you would do this was pretty different. So Borah in particular, he was very antagonistic to the idea that we would bind ourselves to agreements that forced us to do something in the world. As we'll see in a little bit, he was very keen on an idea expressed by George Washington in his farewell speech that we stay out of foreign entanglements. So he didn't want to disengage from the international system, but he didn't want us linked into it in a binding fashion. So in debates over the League of Nations, so the League of Nations, for those of you who don't know, is a precursor to the UN, and it was a proponent proposed by the United States primarily under the head of Woodrow Wilson, who was then the president. Borah was the main opposition actor. He didn't want us to be involved in these foreign entanglements. And he even said at one point that if Providence himself came down from heaven and said, I want you to join the League of Nations, that he would still oppose joining the League of Nations because it was a bad idea to bind up our national fortunes to those of other countries if we didn't get to have a continuing say in it. Whereas Boyd Martin, as a young professor at the University of Idaho, was invited by President Harry Truman to serve on Senator Vandenberg of Minnesota's staff at the UN Charter negotiations in San Francisco in 1945, which means that the Martin Institute has this outlook of global engagement as a thing that's at least worth exploring and attractive. Certainly, if God came down and told us that we should join an organization, we wouldn't still resist the way Borah would. What's nice about it is these two lenses, they're related, but it kind of prevents us at the Martin and the Borah from having an ideological lens because we have at least two, and they're the opposite lenses on how you engage with international systems. It means we can study them and talk about them, but not preach or teach them. One of the things that has changed over the years of there being a Borah Symposium is that it used to be entirely about states going to war. And as the global community has evolved through particularly in the 1980s and 90s and then on, so too has the focal points of the symposium. They've become broader because the international community as a whole has begun to look at intrastate conflict more and trying to assure people a peaceful existence where they're at. It's called human security, and it's basically trying to build up a system whereby human beings can count on their political rights, their community rights, their rights to food, their rights to housing, and several other things like this, which is a little bit different than the original focus of the symposium, which was just about whether countries how they go to war and how we can stop them from going to war. That means we've had broader conversations in recent years. We still focus on the big war and peace idea. Certainly tomorrow's talk from Lieutenant General Eric Peterson about war and peace in the 21st century will be this big picture kind of thing. But President Sagasti tonight, and someday Prince Raad, who you may have heard has had to postpone his visit to the spring, will be talking more about this human security kind of idea that fits with this secondary theme of the symposium. Okay, I'm really supposed to talk about Borah and the Outlawry of War movement. I was trained as a historian. I was trained as a historian by people who had written biographies of William Edgar Borah. Two of the major biographies written by Borah were by professors at Washington State University. But very interesting to me that they're close by, but weren't at the UI, they were at WSU, which means that my training had introductions to Borah and his role both in the United States and the world. But I'm also something of a lapsed historian, trained as one, but the way some people fall away from a church or something. My job in the interdisciplinary trio of things I run doesn't permit me to engage all the time in the study of practice of history. So it's really a nice opportunity to prepare this talk and dive back into some of those same old notes, the books from beloved professors, and look at it that way. Borah was in the Senate from 1907 to 1940. It's a pretty fascinating time period for a lot of reasons, which I don't have time to go into today. But I'd be happy to talk to you about it. I'm not an expert on this part of Borah's life, his public role, but fairly able to converse about a lot of them, but not an expert. My lens is the outlawry of war movement. That's what I know most about. And so for that, I want to hit this. George Washington's farewell address in the 1796, I believe, he gave this address. And it was intended for the American public writ large and politicians as well. And he had three main tenets. And it is such a significant moment in history that it is still today annually read on the floor of the US Senate. The Senate gets together, they're all there. Someone is chosen to read Washington's farewell address. And early in his time in the Senate, Borah was chosen to read the address. It's not surprising that Borah ever gets asked to read something or orate, because that was one of the things he was very famous for, was his ability to speak and captivate an audience. But in this case, if I have anything original to contribute to the study of Borah, it'd be his adherence through his principles throughout those 33 years to these tenets. And I'm going to talk about one in particular, the avoidance of foreign entanglements. But you can see the tenets of avoiding loyalty to party over nation, and of the importance of national unity in what he does. He's not a great partisan, much to the frustration of the Republican Party, who often wanted to take more dogmatic stands on issues. He would take what he considered pragmatic stands. He would support oftentimes, democratic administrations and ideals. He just wasn't a good loyalist in a party, because he's adhering to this. And certainly if you read his writings at the end of his life, he's talking about Washington's farewell address in ways he doesn't early, but I think we could connect them pretty easily. So in the avoidance of foreign entanglements, one of the places that he is active is on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So this slide has more than just Senator Borah. It has Senator Frank Church and Senator James Risch, all of whom have headed up the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee. So the Senate itself has the challenge of working the Senate would be really something, because there's only 100 of them and they're supposed to have expertise in pretty much everything. So you allow between 6 and 11 senators to serve on a variety of committees, where they're either looking to introduce legislation, or in the case of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, or Foreign Affairs Committee, I'm sorry, is to advise and consent with the president and the executive branch on initiatives there. Now, if you're on the committee, and Borah was on the committee by, I think, 1912, doesn't become the chair until 1924. The difference is, if you're the chair, then you get to introduce topics as opposed to just react to them. So as we work forward a little bit in this conversation to the outlawry of war movement, which really hits about the mid-20s, he's in a good position to promote this as an American initiative. or initiative that could be adopted by the United States, differently than if he was a junior member. So Frank Church and James Risch both did some interesting things when they were chairs. I do find it pretty fascinating that our little Intermountain state, far away from the halls of power, have had 3 chairs of the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee. And this is because of that idea that Borah had, that all these big global ideas come back to us in Idaho. Certainly, it's a useful anecdote to have in your pocket at the Martin or the Borah. When we're bringing someone in, oftentimes the press will say, why should Idahoans care? Because it's far away and it doesn't, well, these people care. They care because it connects back to us. Okay, so this sets up the idea that he's an influential senator. He's on the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, and when a new idea comes forward, he's in a great position to advocate for it. So first, we're going to set some groundwork on how war was conceptualized through the end of the 1920s. So this says through the end of the Great War, but we'll go through the end of the 1920s with this, because that's when what we're coming up to, the success of the Outlawry War movement, happens in 1928. So it was considered legal and appropriate and simply a tool of foreign policy that nations warred with each other. It wasn't really questioned. You might question whether you liked what they did or whether you agreed with them invading somewhere, but they had the right to do it. There was no one saying this is illegal. Certainly there were philosophers and religious groups trying to figure out what would constitute a just war, what would justify going to war. In the eyes of the states and their fellow other states, you didn't really need a justification because you were a state, and states had the right to go to war. So it's a really strange conceptualization that it was appropriate and allowable to go to war. So when you hear outlawry war, what sometimes people hear is that there's an attempt to make war no longer happen. And sure, that's a goal. That's maybe the underlying goal. But the real goal is to make it so that it's not acceptable to go to war, that it's not a de facto possession or de facto thing that states are allowed to do. They're going to make it illegal to go to war. We make a lot of things illegal and people still do them. So I don't want to suggest that because people still go to war occasionally, that the outlawry war movement is a failure. But when we look at this and then these 4 things underneath that happen because the outlawry of because nations are allowed the unconditional use of force, it's going to flip pretty dramatically by the 1930s. And this won't be the only thing that flips it. There's other trends happening in the world, but certainly this idea was pervasive and then flips. So I'm going to come back to this, but here's a list of rationale. So a group of researchers at Yale University, they looked at every declaration of war from I think 1492 to the outbreak of World War II, issued by a sovereign. So the sovereign could be anybody it could have been an individual, or they included in sovereign a nation state issuing a declaration of war. So if they had sovereignty still. So it doesn't include more localized conflicts where there was no sovereign, there was no declaration if they couldn't account for why war was declared, but they went through all the issuances of warfare and went through. And so these are the most common. So some of them are pretty banal. They're property conflicts. So a tort is a claim about property damage. So if you had a trader, T-R-A-D-E-R, not T-O-R, a trader who had their goods destroyed in a port facility, you could have a tort claim and go in to collect the debt. Just debt, if you owed money, that was a very common rationale for occupying and invading a country. They owed you money and you wanted to collect it, so you would invade. But all of these are part of it. And they don't have to be particularly grand ideas. But there they are. So there's the unquestioned use of force for all these reasons. And under that, then it becomes that conquest is acceptable. So if war is okay, conquest is acceptable. We're not talking about conquest as in you won the war. You're talking about you won the war and now you're taking someone else's territory. So this is going to be a key difference after the outlawry war movement takes its course, is that conquest will no longer be recognized. So you can see like what happens. I know this is an odd thing to do to talk about in the midst of the largest land war in Europe since the end of World War II, which we have in the Russo-Ukraine war. But in this case, no one has acknowledged that Russia gets to keep what they took. And before this, when we're in this era, there were about 11 Crimean peninsulas that changed hands on average every year. That much territory changed hands every year. And when it changed hands, it was then recognized by the other states as belonging to the conqueror, which we don't have anymore. It's going to flip. Casualties are acceptable. In fact, there was no real differentiation between they're all humans, between non-combatants and combatants. We're not talking about war crimes or crimes against civilians prior to this. Gunboat diplomacy, this was a technique used by powerful states to basically sail their warships into harbors, up rivers, insist on capitulations from the places they went. And one of the most interesting to me is other countries were not allowed, they could join the war, but they couldn't do things to make it uncomfortable for those fighting. You were supposed to be neutral. You're in the war or you're out of the war. So a lot of the things that we look at as common tools to try and keep countries from fighting now, sanctions regimes, embargoes, pulling ambassadors, these kinds of activities that that were short of actual conflict, these were, if they weren't illegal, they were inappropriate and frowned upon. So the war was more acceptable than a peaceful reaction to the war. How does this play out in the United States? And what does Borah think? Well, we were active in all these things. We may have been late to the colonial game, but we got the hang of it quickly. So the Roosevelt corollary was a policy enacted by Theodore Roosevelt when he was president of the United States. Theodore Roosevelt and Borah were actually friends. They're in the same party. Later in the 20s or so, Borah has a long, decades-long affair with one of Teddy's daughters. They have a child together. So one of Teddy's grandchildren is also Borah's child. It's maybe not the stuff they talk about mostly when talk about Borah, but anyway, they're friends. But Borah really dislikes Teddy Roosevelt's application of the Monroe Doctrines. The Monroe Doctrines issued in 1821 by James Monroe. It says essentially the Western Hemisphere is the US sphere of influence and the old world needs to stay out. And, you know, it was kind of bravado when it first was issued, but later on we have the capacity to back it up. And under Roosevelt, he looked at this concept that you could declare war for debt collection in particular, and that it was acceptable to use gunboat diplomacy. And his theory was that to avoid European powers coming into the Caribbean in particular, into Central America, into Northern South America to collect debts, we would do it preemptively. We would send our gunboats, we would occupy, and we would collect the debt on behalf of the foreign powers, give it to them, and then probably, hopefully, maybe leave. There's some pretty long stints that we stay in the Dominican Republic, in Haiti, in Cuba, in Nicaragua several times, in Venezuela and Mexico. We also use gunboat diplomacy, also criticized heavily by Borah. He believes you need to stay unentangled from these foreign affairs. And he also believes that countries have the right to have whatever kind of administration they want to have. So it's very peculiar to people that, for example, when the Bolsheviks win in the Russian Revolution, he says we should recognize them. It really goes against the party and the party structure, who thinks we definitely should not. But he said that country has the right to that government. During the 1910s, which he's still a younger senator, most of the 1910s are characterized by, to the south of us, a pretty chaotic revolution in Mexico. And oftentimes the US executive branch was very interested in what kind of regime was going to come to power. And there were some people from the center sometimes, and people from the right and people from the left, and those folks also changed sides. The Mexican Revolution is as chaotic and complicated a thing as you can ever hope to study. And Borah's like, you know, whoever's in power is who we should treat with. So he doesn't believe in these ideas that Teddy and company are promulgating. Gunboat diplomacy also is one. So this is an image of Admiral Perry in the 1850s opening Japan. I think we kind of talk about this in US history as this great moment when we opened Japan, and now Japan was going to trade with us. We sent the warships into the harbor and threatened to bomb them unless they opened up. It was a pretty clear threat. We joined other European powers in sailing up rivers in Asia to force them to open. We send, during the Mexican Revolution, we send warships into Veracruz Harbor. We do this. And Borah criticizes it. But it's sort of to say this was not a thing that was just esoteric done in the old world. It was done here as well. So enter this fella. So this is one of the best named human beings on the planet. I don't know why Salmon has fallen out as one of the top boy names out there, because, you know, some people have themes where they do J names, or you could do a whole series of fish names for all of your children. But I shouldn't tease that, because he's a lawyer from Chicago who has an idea, and it's a revolutionary, brilliant idea. So got to be some people who thought of this before, but there's usually a starter to a movement, and Salmon Levinson is the origin point. He writes an article in the New Republic where he says, "What if we made war illegal? Like what if it wasn't the thing that states were just allowed to do? What if we said, guess what, states, you aren't allowed to do this. And if you do it, you're going against global ideals and global norms." So here's a couple of quotes of his, and then an aphorism. So the old Roman quote, or aphorism, their own, I don't know if it's a quote, is that if you want peace, prepare for war. And he said, actually, you could prepare for peace if you want peace. You could set up the structures so that peace is the acceptable default option, not that you're poised for war all the time. And he began to write. He began to travel. He was a bankruptcy lawyer who had made a decent fortune. He uses his own money to bankroll it. He eventually bankrolls the Borah Foundation for the Outlawry of War at the University of Idaho. So our genesis is his as well. But one of the things he really needed is that, even though there were a lot of people who were involved, what he needed, if he wants to make it national policy, is a way in. He needs to be able to get this idea into U.S. politics. And he finds two senators who are appealing to him. So Borah, he knew, was, if not liable to join, he might be interested. But they had a lot of ideological disagreements just within the movement. For example, one of the ideas that Levinson had, and that others like him had, was that you would use force to enforce peace. That you could go for an agreement to outlaw war, but the punishment for going to war was war. And Borah said, no, if you're going to outlaw war, war needs to cease to be the acceptable tool. That at least you strive for it. And the other was, should there be a court where you could you could sue each other at the national level, so that instead of going to war for things like debt collection, could you just have a lawsuit and go to court? Seems naive, but it still exists today. We have something called the International Court of Justice that handles these kinds of disputes, that is voluntary, that states can say, let's settle something. They used to be things that, a lot of the things that are settled there are low-level boundary disputes. Maybe boundaries didn't used to be drawn with the precision of GPS and laser guided tracking and stuff from satellites, right? They went through a sand dune, or the river changed course or something. So lots of those kinds of things are handled there. So perhaps they wouldn't rise to the level of warfare anyway, but it used to be that they did for these kinds of reasons. So they have some disagreements, but Borah adopts it, right? So should force be used on states? And could it become a political question? So Borah Borah used the U.S. train system pretty assiduously. So one of the things that I know that Senator Risch, who's one of our current senators of Idaho, he's proud of, is that he's able to come home to Idaho on a weekly basis. You can catch a direct flight from Washington, D.C. back to Boise. You can be there on the weekend. A lot harder in the era of train travel. But Borah did make a point of being in the state on at least an annual basis, and he was famous for visiting every hamlet and every burg up and down the state. But he also rode the train a lot in the eastern part of the country. And he began to do stump speeches on behalf of the Outlawry of War movement, make war illegal. And he also then, as the chair of the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, was able to give some very powerful Senate speeches about this idea. So here's just a short quote of his from one of these speeches in 1926, which is about when they succeed in convincing. We should cheat forward here. I'm going to come back to this. So let's cheat forward to here. So the way policymaking works in the lawmaking, treaty making works in the United States is it's the executive branch that actually goes out and negotiates things. And it can be very confusing to people sometimes who say, the U.S. agreed to such and such there. You say, kind of, the executive branch agreed to that, but we didn't collectively agree to it, because unless an agreement, a signature from the executive branch comes back to the Senate and is ratified, essentially gets the stamp of approval, we're not bound to follow it. It was the indication that the executive branch was interested. It's got to be the legislature that approves. So a lot of treaty making comes from the executive, and then they come back to the legislative branch to try and get it passed. In this case, the idea is going to come out of the legislature that there should be a binding pact negotiated and go up to the executive branch. In this case, Calvin Coolidge, who was the president, and Frank Kellogg, who was the Secretary of State. Borah is going to take this idea and run with the Senate and get almost the whole Senate. There were 86 senators at the time. By the time the pact comes back for a vote, it's 85-1 in the Senate. It's pretty uncommon to get this is a treaty, and we're going to ratify a signature at 85-1. So this has to happen. So Borah has to convince Kellogg and Coolidge. Well, Coolidge, and then Kellogg will go out on behalf of Coolidge. So he says, Mr. President, I am opposed to the recognition of the right to employ force against a sovereign nation in any contemplated plan of peace. After 2,000 years of this worship of force, after 2,000 years of this teaching and of the practice which flows from such teaching, what are the results? What are the fruits? If anyone is familiar with the vernacular of hell, let him undertake to paint the picture, because human tongue is inadequate to the task. It's a long, gorgeous speech. Now, when Borah was president, the newspapers loved him. Editors loved him, reporters loved him. And this was a newspaper culture. So we're kind of used to the idea. I think we still remember a time when daily newspapers were common in most of our communities. When he was there were multiple dailies in most markets, and actually multiple editions of most dailies in most markets. He was really good for copy that people like to read, not because he was himself particularly flamboyant or was courting controversy or anything like that, but because he could speak so dramatically and clearly. So all those sorts of things he could be back in the news repeatedly, multiple times in a day. So the idea, it comes from Levinson. It goes to church groups. Universities were very powerful in this movement, professors and university presidents kind of collectively. I think university presidents used to have a different role than they do now. Right now, university presidents are primarily outward facing individuals who work with politicians and stuff to support us in our state, for example. But this was a time when university presidents were still also intellectuals, and they adopt this and lots of writing from university presidents. Like I said, the Grange movement, the Methodist Church, lots of other church groups, they're active. And they get the speaker in Borah. We go through this process, and you end up with, in 1928, something called the Kellogg-Briand Pact. So it's got a lot of names. And we had a speaker here several years ago who was here on the 70th anniversary of the Borah, Scott Shapiro, who was co-author of a book called The Internationalists, which looked mostly at Levinson, less at Borah. But where they would, he said that one of the problems with this and why it doesn't get a lot of press or a lot of credit now is because it's known by about 8 different names, depending on where you're at. But we'll call it the Kellogg-Briand Pact, Kellogg being the US Secretary of State, Briand being the French foreign minister. So it doesn't carry Borah's name, but this is a Borah initiative. And this is the entire, I'm giving you the whole treaty. This is it. You're reading the whole thing. It's not a very complicated document. And as you see, it has no teeth. And one of the criticisms of it is it has no teeth. It's not supposed to have teeth. It's supposed to set up a norm. We're going to come back here in a minute, but look at the difference in international law between something that is binding and sets up something that you're required to do and something that norms, which sets up an expectation that you're going to follow. And these are not exclusive lists. There are exceptions that go in both, but there are kinds of agreements that tend to go through a process that has language in the treaty that requires you to do something. And there are others that strongly encourage or suggest or set up a norm. And in fact, there are some binding ones that we don't join, we haven't signed or ratified, but that we still follow. We accept it as a norm. For example, there's an interesting tie to the Borah. One year we had Jody Williams as a keynote speaker. She's a Nobel Peace Prize winner for her work on the international campaign to ban landmines. Landmines are a pretty heinous kind of munition. They're easy and cheap to produce. They're hard to keep track of. They stay active for years or decades into the fact, and civilians are the most common victim. So this prevents, this treaty prevents the production, stockpiling, or use of these munitions. And so we said, as the United States, we agree with this in principle, but on the Korean border, we're going to use, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of landmines we have there to make sure that the North Koreans can't sweep down and take South Korea. And we said, if you put a part in the treaty that said we could use them there, we'd join the treaty. But there's no exception to the treaty. Right? So we refuse to join, but we're also the main funder of other countries to adhere to the treaty. So there can be a lot of things that set up that are binding, but we actually norm ourselves to it. We do it anyway. A norm can be an important thing. You can still follow it and do it, even if it's not binding. So let's go. Okay, we read that there. Let's go here. So if we're talking about this as the status quo and this as the four outgrowths of it, here's what you get after the Paris Peace Pact, the Kellogg-Briand Pact. There's a prohibition on the use of force. And so conquest gains are not recognized. And the first time this is tested is in 1931. So there's war pretty quickly after this. So first we're like, this is a failure. Japan in 1931 conquers Manchuria. And the world says, we don't recognize that. And the Japanese are, in some senses, offended. They're shocked. I mean, the Western powers took territory all over the world and it was fine. And now they do it. And suddenly we say no. Then a few years later, Mussolini and the Italians conquered Ethiopia. And the world said, no, you can't do that. And so the norm is flipped. So that before this, you would have arguably, perhaps, probably, we don't have a good test to see if Japan had taken territory before that, what would have happened, but that the gains aren't recognized. Aggressive war is criminalized. So you're going to see after this a whole series of things called the Geneva Conventions, which delineate what happens if you violate the idea that citizens should be spared as much as possible from direct impacts from a conflict, not the aftermath of conflict. There's no real provision for that. Duress defense basically says that you're still allowed to defend yourself, so it doesn't suggest you can't fight if you're attacked. But sanctions and other means are now accepted and encouraged. So the idea of neutrality is flipped. And what you'd see then in a place like what's happened in Russia and Crimea is that instead of now 8 years worth of sanctions and protests, there would have been recognition of the rights of conquest, and that would have been acknowledged broadly as Russian territory. So this is an outgrowth of William Edgar Borah's work on behalf of peace and the outlawry of war, for and on behalf of the United States and for and on behalf of the citizens of Idaho. When he dies, he dies, I wouldn't say in an anachronism, but World War II has started in Europe. And he's still trying to keep us out of war, trying to keep us out of that entanglement. And I can't speak to the future and what would have happened if he and others saw what the US goes through and the world goes through in World War II, and whether they would agree with Martin that getting us involved in the United Nations would be a good idea. I would like to think that the war, World War II, would show that there was some value in it. But I don't know that, and there's certainly no writings to suggest anything else. But I do think it's a worthwhile legacy, and it's one that's important to the citizens of Idaho and to the University of Idaho. I thank you for your time, and we'll open it up to some questions. I think we have about 10 minutes if you have any.
I'll run to the mic. Could you, the one thing that was going through my mind about the Grange ties to Borah would be agricultural products on the international market. I take it a number of these Grange groups were producing wheat Is this one of the factors of why they're so, maybe it's an obvious answer. Could this be inspiring their interest in Borah?
A good question. So Borah has, because he's a senator and there's only 100 senators, so they, even though there might be 6 to 11 on a specific Senate committee, they're involved with all topics. And Borah was often involved in heavy conversations about agricultural policy. There's a point when he's a new senator, when Teddy Roosevelt was president, and the Grange movement, and particular dryland, scrubland farmers in the southern part of the state wanted more time to be able to prove their claims than the federal government would allow them. And Borah asked for more time. Roosevelt said no. Borah then said, well, I'm going to tell my people to have the rifles ready when you come to kick them off their land. And Teddy Roosevelt backs off and gives them more time. I think those kinds of things make him a friend of the farmer. But as far as export and grain export goes, he also did some things in that idea of sort of nation over party. If he saw a bill that would favor Idaho farmers or Idaho ag that he didn't think was good for the interests of the country, he would go against it. And it got him into trouble sometimes. But I think people saw overarching that he was in their corner. But I haven't seen anything specifically about that tie, about the Outlawry of War movement. I think it just it resonates. Certainly, Boyd Martin was a wheat farmer. And the funding of the Martin Institute comes from the proceeds of wheat harvests each year. And when Boyd Martin started his institute, the first people he went to visit were the Granges and the farming groups in Idaho to talk about war and peace. So I think it's a hoped for connection in our state. Thanks.
I mentioned this to you a couple of days ago that in the first episode of Ken Burns's latest documentary about the U.S. and the Holocaust, there's a brief mention of Borah of Idaho being on the side of not wanting to let Jewish immigrants from Europe into the U.S. And would you say that's just an example of his avoiding foreign entanglements, of his pragmatic approach to things, or how would you explain that?
I can really only answer that in relation to it as part of his approach. So about 10 years earlier, a few years earlier than that, 1919 to 21, 22, Armenian Christians endured a genocide at the hands of the Ottoman Turks. And Borah did not support mass immigration of the Christians from Armenia either. That it was an isolationist and nativist stance as opposed to ideologically against the Jews, even in the face of some pretty terrible atrocities, as happened to the Armenians. Similar thing during the Mexican Revolution. He didn't want large numbers of Mexican immigrants. So I would say that his outlook was a common, that people who might be considered to have liberal outlooks in the United States, also was definitely a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant liberalism that doesn't favor other groups, regardless of religious affiliation or origin. If they're not WASPs, they're all kind of out. Please.
So I have sorry, please.
With this potential outlawing of war, are we making room and considerations for intervening in human rights when people groups are fighting back against regimes?
Yeah, certainly not at this time, no. So that kind of thing with the responsibility to protect and a genocide convention and things that talk about intervening comes after World War II, when the folks who didn't want the binding power or anything to come afterwards realized that there's going to be maybe there's a regime like the Nazis that you have to do, right? Yes, right, but that you might have to bind yourself differently than you would. So in many of the international agreements that come later they use the language. So one of the things you'll find is that the Kellogg-Briand Pact here, the tenets, there's not a lot of tenets in it, but that they get cited in future agreements or initiatives. Even in the Nuremberg trials, which follow World War II, they cite the Kellogg-Briand Pact for why they're able to do this, that it shows that they were an aggressor and they weren't allowed to be an aggressor. And later, when you start talking about these other approaches to peace, then it gets cited there too.
Yeah, so the Borah has quite a legacy in terms of the changing of the norms around war and ultimately changes to international law regarding war. And after World War II, we see a lot less conflict between states, and that legacy follows. My question, though, is what do you think is the relative importance of those sorts of changes to law and norms versus the sort of de facto power of the United States with the Pax Americana in the post-war era to sort of enforce an international peace?
Yeah, absolutely. It's sort of like when we did the Monroe Doctrine in the 1820s, it was largely enforced by the Pax Britannica, where the British Navy enforced what we had said was going to happen. And we do use this. It's not just that, but I thought maybe you, as my colleague from economics, was going to go to the Bretton Woods institutions and stuff that get set up after World War II to try and bind economies together to make it sure it's painful economically to go to war. So there are definitely multiple movements, and of which the outlawry war movement gives underpinning of the structure to set up others. So the spread of democracies, I don't know if you call it a benefit of a two global powers in detente kind of occupying the Pax Americana and other things. So there's definitely other trends. It doesn't operate alone. And I think you're going to bring a question from.
We have two questions from Zoom. From Professor Kenton Bird in New Zealand. Greetings from New Zealand. Question: did Idaho newspaper editorials support the outlawry of war in general and the Kellogg-Briand Pact in particular? And did any of his Senate opponents ever challenge his position on this issue?
I'll take the last one. I'll pretend I only heard the third part of the question. I think a politician would be better at this than me, to not answer the part you don't know the answer to and just skip to the one you know. Very popular in the Senate. As I said, 85-1 by the time the Kellogg-Briand Pact came back. I haven't looked at Idaho newspaper editorials and the like. It's a good idea. And when he comes back, I will walk down the hall and he and I can do it.
Well, we know he always likes to ask hard questions. So the second one is from Mr. Todd Mordhurst. I think I've pronounced correctly. Can you speak to Borah's interest in the presidency in 1936? That would be Franklin Roosevelt, and perhaps how that affected the dynamics between Borah and FDR.
Yeah, Borah and FDR had a very interesting dynamic. For example, the first speaker this is the 75th annual Borah Symposium, but the actual first symposium was in 1938, 10 years before we keep our annual count. And the speaker was Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the first woman, first lady. And so she's the first lady, a wife of FDR, against whom Borah had staged kind of a nascent political campaign in 1936. So the idea that she comes to honor Borah at the first Borah Symposium would suggest and demonstrate that they had a very easy working relationship. FDR likes, Borah likes a lot of the ideas that FDR puts forward. He likes a lot of the New Deal. He supports it. And frankly, when he runs for president, he's suggested as a candidate, but not a viable candidate for a long time. He doesn't raise a lot of money. He doesn't do a lot of things that party structures like. He's mentioned a long time, but seen kind of more of as a kingmaker than a presidential candidate himself. But there really wasn't anybody viable in 1936. So he throws his hat in the ring. He's older and frailer, and it doesn't go well. And he ultimately is not chosen to challenge FDR. So it's not one where it impacts their working relationship at all.
I would simply add as an historian that there's another Idaho connection here, and that is Hemingway had met with Eleanor Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt, begging them to enter the Spanish Civil War because he foresaw World War II coming. So, I mean, there's a lot going on in terms of the politics of war during that period.
Right.
So, very interesting. Other questions or comments?
Now we're at 1:20. Oh, we got one. Okay.
Do you want to go? Go ahead. There you go.
Since we're talking about FDR, what would Borah have to say about the arsenal of democracy and helping democratic nations fight foreign wars?
So the good news so by the time that comes in, I don't know about but we actually cite the Kellogg-Briand Pact as a reasonable justification for doing that. That before, that would have been a violation of the neutrality doctrine. And after, it's an acceptable use of our authority under the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And Professor Graydon, I think we're
getting real close. We have one more minute. Any other? Are there any more coming in? We have one more. Is that okay? From Sally Powell, did Borah's reputation as someone who worked across political lines in the United States have any bearing on his ability to work on the outlawry of war movement internationally, or did he try to keep out of the international elements broadly?
Yeah, for a guy who was really interested in the international sphere, he never left the United States. So he may have people that he was connected with internationally, but the only time he really talks about traveling would be to go to try and stop Hitler from an expansionist war. He thinks if he could go talk to him, he wasn't alone in this thinking. There were a lot of people who thought that before they started doing territorial acquisition that Hitler could be reasoned with, but otherwise he's not really aspiring to travel internationally himself. It is almost entirely domestic and leaving the international part to Levinson and his network, because in Levinson's network there were people in a lot of different countries who were agitating for this at the same time.
It's incredible how relevant all of this is to today. You mentioned Russia, Ukraine. Until recently, 70 out of 100 senators did not have US passports. So another example of sort of we're on an island and, isolationism, we could call it. So on behalf of everybody here and the Renfrew and the Borah Symposium and the University of Idaho, we say a big thanks to Bill for his presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.